Okay, hello and
Hello.
welcome to the next instalment of Threat Talk LinkedIn Live. My name's James Allpress. I'm the product marketing director of BioCatch, and I'm excited to be joined by a very special guest today. Professor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, James. Hi. So I'm Professor Donna Youngs. I have spent my career studying criminal behaviour, but I've spent that time studying it from the perspective of an investigative psychologist. And what that means is that I look at the details of the psychological style that offenders bring to the way they carry out offences. Because whatever the offence, there are many, many different ways that you can carry out that offence. And the decisions that offenders make tells us an awful lot about who they are, about their psychology, about their backgrounds. Now, I've been able to use that understanding and expertise to unravel the ways in which romance scammers are managing somehow to persuade victims to give them enormous, in some cases, enormous amounts of money, how they manage to carry out that persuasion.
Fantastic. I mean, and that's why I think you're perfect for this next edition, which is called A True Romance, Understanding the Mindset of Romance Scammers and Victims. Because obviously we're in February now, and one of the first things you think about in February is Valentine's Day, right? Yeah. It's just around the corner. Yeah. And it's very plausible to suggest that there's probably a few more people on the hunt for love and romance and companionship. So therefore, there are a few more people walking around that are perhaps susceptible to romance scams at the moment. And as a fraud fighter at BioCatch, and like all the other guys at BioCatch, we feel we've got a sense of duty to raise awareness of romance scams. Hence your invitation today to talk on the topic. So, you know, just before we go into it, I guess just to very quickly highlight the scale of the problem. If you take a look at the UK financial reports from last year in the first half, there was actually £18.5 million lost to romance scams alone. And that was actually a 23% increase compared to the same time last year. So it's definitely a problem that is still on the up. It's not a problem that's on the down. Another interesting thing I noticed in that report was approximately 9 payments are associated to a romance scam, and they happen over a period of time. And I guess to paint a bit more of a picture of that, one thing that really stuck out from the report is that some of the people where a romance scam was actually initiated in the COVID lockdown are only coming to terms with now that they were a victim of a romance scam, because they happen over that long period of time. So it's a really cruel type of scam, very damaging both emotionally and financially. But anyway, I do want to talk about those 9 payments and those education efforts and awareness efforts around those payments that happen. I do want to go back to that. But first and foremost, and I guess the reason you're here, Donna, is that I really want to get your perspective on both sides of the fence of the scam. So I really want to understand what you know about romance scammers and victims. But let's start off with the scammer, the fraudster.
Well, yeah, James, I mean, and you're absolutely right. The problem is increasing at a really alarming rate. I mean, most of the studies that have been carried out have been very recent studies, so because it just wasn't a thing on this kind of scale prior to 2016 or so. But even the most conservative of estimates from those really recent studies suggest 1 in 16 of us will be targeted by a romance scammer. And there are even studies that suggest that when you look at particular subsamples, that you're talking about anything up to 63% of people say that they have been targeted by a romance scammer. I mean, we really need to change our thinking from assuming that this is just a problem whereby a few vulnerable people get targeted, there are a few unfortunate cases, to understanding that this is an ever-present modern-day threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know you've had lots of investigations and interactions around previous romance scammers. I mean, what can you tell us about, you know, the mindset of a romance scammer? What makes them tick, if you like?
No, well, okay. I mean, it's curious because, I mean, once upon a time, a con artist was just that, an artist, albeit of a destructive variant. I mean, it was somebody who was so skilled at interpersonal interactions that there was something distinct about these individuals. But these days, that's not what we're looking at. These days, we're looking at organized criminal groups. We're looking at people who are motivated purely and simply by finance, by money. They're not people, it's an absolutely instrumental motivation that we're talking about. There's no particular enjoyment of the process of the manipulation itself. Contrary to popular assumptions, these are not necessarily psychopathic individuals who enjoy their ability to manipulate and exploit. Instead, what they are organized, systematic networks of criminals who are so focused on the financial gain that the victims themselves are actually completely irrelevant. They are focused entirely and utterly on the win, on the financial gain. So we can almost understand them better as gamblers, as gamers. They're individuals for whom the people that they're targeting really don't register at all, which I think is probably one of the most galling things of all for the victims who have thought that they've been part of a meaningful relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it must be absolutely heart-wrenching. Not to mention the financial side of things, but to, you know, be led down a garden path for up to, you know, 2 years in some cases. And then to suddenly find out that, you know, what you think is happening is not happening.
Yeah, it's a triple. It really is a triple whammy. You've got the financial loss. You've got the loss of your dignity, your self-esteem, your belief in a just world, as we psychologists call it, and in the fairness of things. But also, and perhaps surprisingly, you're also undergoing a very real bereavement. Even if the relationship was not based on anything real, you still experience a profound sense of loss. So really a triple whammy.
Yeah, and you know, I mentioned those figures and numbers in the beginning, but we actually know that a large percentage of people don't actually report a romance scam as well. So actually the numbers aren't the numbers. They're probably a lot worse than what they are. So yeah, absolutely terrible to be on the receiving end of one of these types of scams. So yeah, that's great. That's a really good insight to what's going on with the fraudster and what makes them tick and what motivates them. So let's now turn our attention to the victims. So I'm not sure if you had a chance to take a look at that Javelin strategy and research report. I just mentioned that statistic around, you know, males much more likely to become the victim of a romance scam than females, 73% versus 27%. Considering your background, Professor, does that come as a surprise to you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are some similarities actually in terms of the people that get involved in stalking offences, because there's the same kind of underlying dynamic that goes wrong in terms of a relationship here. But I mean, one of the things which allows the whole romance scam thing to unfold is the way that the person, as soon as they become the victim, as soon as they become involved in the process switches themselves, withdraws entirely from the world. So if there's a greater tendency for men to do this, then I think that may provide some kind of explanation as to why that we're getting these high figures. Very, very quickly, the scammers put in place a play where they talk about this. They start talking about the future. They start talking about exclusivity. They start talking in very, very serious terms about the permanence of the relationship. And what this does is it causes the victim to take themselves out of the rest, away from the rest of the world. It's a way of securing the fairy tale that they feel that they've come upon. So they take themselves out of any possible threats from the outside world to this wonderful thing that they've come across. And of course, what that does is that takes them away from any kind of logic, any kind of possible causes of doubt or concern expressed, which just seeks to reinforce the bubble that they find themselves in.
Yeah, and you touch on a very important point, actually, and this was actually going to be my next question. But, I've sat in a room with many retail banks, and I've actually spoken directly to victims themselves. And they quite often refer to this kind of spell or trance that these victims are under. What can you tell us about this kind of spell that they find themselves under?
Yeah, the scammers are very clever. They follow some very well-established psychological rules of persuasion. They bombard the victims with attention. They create heightened levels of excitement. Sorry, let me start. Sorry, James. So the scammers use some really well-established psychological principles of persuasion. So they bombard their victims with attention, daily attention, so that the victims start to rely upon that attention. They create a sense of excitement by generating visions of a future together, and this all stimulates some really visceral emotions. Human beings make decisions by one of two routes. There's either a very logical route, or there's what we call a peripheral processing route. And what the scammers do is to activate this route. And this is a route that relies entirely on visceral emotional reactions. So they do everything they can to activate that peripheral route using all these different techniques and strategies.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so I personally think this all should be part of the considerations for retail banks when they're, pursuing their sort of scam education and awareness efforts, would be my suggestion, I guess. Which leads me on to my third and final question, Donna. Before this interview, I did fire over some scam education and prevention efforts from a well-known global and UK bank, a bank that I personally bank with as well. And I think the level of those efforts are very, very good. But, knowing what you know about fraudsters and victims, what's your opinion on those scam education efforts?
But if you're talking about basic prevention, then some of that's going to work. But if you're looking to stop people at the critical, when people are about to pay, that is a much more critical stage. You're much further down the line. And at that stage, the kind of material that I've seen is just not powerful enough. It's just nowhere near emotionally powerful enough. You've got to realize that at this point, somebody is beyond logical consideration. They're so separate from that way of thinking from the rest of the world that the only possible way that we can have any impact whatsoever is to jolt. They need jolting out of the spell that they are in, and the only possible way to do that is to counteract the powerful narrative that they've been given with an equally shocking narrative of what the reality is. And by that I mean they need to know that the messages they're getting are being generated from, they need to have a clear vision that the messages they're getting are being generated by a network of offenders, of criminals working together, having pre-prepared scripts that they are ready to give them, that they are oblivious to who they're dealing with, particularly as an individual, that they're testing out hundreds of victims. They need to have this image, this vision presented to them in very clear, unequivocal terms, because they need to counteract the fairy tale vision that they're working with, and that is persuading them to make that payment in that moment of payment.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. So a jolt, that's what really stuck with me. And I think, I would love to talk about this for, hours, Donna. I think there's so much opportunity here to get your perspective on how to help with these situations and the awareness and the education efforts. I know we're out of time now. I know you've got to run off to your next appointment. So I'll just round off by saying that was absolutely fantastic. My favorite LinkedIn Threat Talk Live by far. So thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. And I do hope that we can work again more in the future. And that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And goodbye.
Bye, James. Bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you.